Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy.
This is episode number 97, Mirroring Anatomies. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today, where we are going to talk about something very interesting and important.
And remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. That would be really helpful. We just want to get this out to as many people as we can. If you find this helpful, then hopefully it will be helpful to other people.
That's right. So today we are going to dive into a topic that is usually not covered in regular sex ed. And when we think about what we were taught about our bodies, maybe in 4th grade, 5th grade, or junior high, maybe even high school, it's always focused on the reproductive system, which is great. It's important for us to know how our bodies work. And this is especially true for women and what we're taught. But what is usually left out is what's behind all of that.
And also nowadays we're starting to get into alternative lifestyles and things like that. And skipping over all of this stuff that's super important for people who want to have really good intimate relationships.
That's right. And so what we're going to talk about today is how from the moment an embryo is conceived, we start growing the same. It's not until several weeks in that the embryo will either form into a male or a female.
Correct.
And so we have actually mirroring parts, and they have just been rearranged, and they end up showing differently anatomically between a male and female. And the part that is usually not discussed is the female pleasure internal organs.
Yes.
And what we don't know, and the part that, again, that is missing, is that a woman's clitoris is at the heart of her experiencing pleasure during intercourse. And you're not going to find a diagram of the clitoris in high school.
No.
Which means
no.
The female and the male, when they're learning about this stuff too, we are left without this knowledge.
And I promise you, your parents haven't taught you this either. Like the diagram of the clitoris.
Right.
And what it actually looks like behind, as far as the internal parts of the clitoris and the way that it's shaped. We only see the tip of the iceberg. That's
right. And that's such a good analogy because only one part of the clitoris is visible. And that's even if you have a spouse or you know where the clitoris is. If a female knows where the clitoris is, that's one thing. But if she doesn't, and you're just looking at it from an outside point of view, it's not obvious.
Right. It's not obvious.
It takes dedication to be able to find where it is and to discover it and uncover it. And so when I think about marriage and it being a mystery, this is part of it. Right? Is being able to have someone committed enough to say, hey, I'm willing to go through that work. I love you enough. And there's enough trust developed and nurtured during that time to be able to say, let's get into this.
Let's explore together. Now, so many of us are taught through media and through a really subpar education, either in school or even in the family, about the real details of this. You know, a lot of parents don't like getting into the details of sex with their children, and in school they don't even spend any time on this, on really diving into this for some good reasons and some reasons that, probably aren't that good. But really, it's the responsibility of husband and wife when they get married to explore this together and to really dive into what is going to bring the female pleasure. The male pleasure is a lot more straightforward.
Yes.
It's pretty simple. All of our reproductive and sexual organs are on the outside.
Yes.
We've been using it and touching it. We have to touch it to pee. We've been itching it and moving it around our whole lives.
Right.
We know how it works.
Yes.
And it is not so straightforward for the female. And so when you're married, whether you've been married for 20 years or for 20 days, I think that more knowledge is available and more exploration is always available. We've been married for 20 years and we're still discovering new things.
Yeah, it's true. And so it's interesting because this really comes to my mind because right now we're just wrapping up our program for newlyweds or for those who are engaged and they're about to be married. And it's called First Night, First Year. And it's as we were going through creating this product and, filming the courses, it kept bringing in the back of my mind, like my clients who have been married for over 20 years are still struggling with these things. They come to me and say, I don't know this and I don't know this. And so that's why I was thinking, man, this is such a good opportunity for us to still talk about these things for those who have been married. And so the first thing we want to discuss is the 3 openings.
Yes.
On the female body. And if a woman is lying on her back, we're just going to go top to bottom. So the first opening is the urethra. This is where we go pee. And this is the first hole that is important to understand what it does. Like this has nothing to do with intercourse. The second opening is the vaginal opening. And this is where the penis penetrates into the vagina and deposits sperm. And this is also the same hole where the baby comes out during labor. And the thing that is important about this to know is that there are not a lot of nerve endings in the vagina. And the reason this is valuable information is because this is where we birth babies. If there were tons and tons of nerve endings here, labor would be so painful we would never have multiple children.
Yeah, it's painful enough.
Exactly. It's painful enough with the small amount of nerve endings that we have in the vagina. So a lot of newlyweds are a little bit confused sometimes about where exactly the penis goes. So it does go in the vagina. That's the main place where intercourse takes place.
And look, most people know this, and it's pretty obvious, but there are those cases where, they end up trying to put it in the wrong hole.
That's right. The third hole is the anus. This is where the poop comes out. I think we're all familiar with this. So these are the 3 main holes to be aware of. I always like to think of them starting with the letter P. The first one is for pee. The second one is for penis penetration. And the third one is for poop.
All right. Okay.
So that's important to start off with. Okay, now we're going to talk about the external outside sexual organs, the genitalia for the woman. And this whole outside area altogether is called the vulva. And so that is just like a general term that's like, okay, this is everything on the outside. So we have the labia majora. This is the outer lips of the vagina. And then we have the labia minora. These are the internal folds or the lips. Now, what's interesting is that since we are talking about things that mirror each other as far as anatomy goes, there is a mirroring here, even though they are going to look completely different. The labia would mirror the scrotum.
The labia majora.
The labia majora and the labia minora, they both have nerve endings. And so total, I think there's about 300 to 400 nerves in the labia. And so that is similar to the scrotum.
It's a similar type of skin.
Yes, a similar type of skin. And so this is really valuable information when you think about being able to enjoy the sexual experience, because men like the feeling of their scrotum being touched in certain ways, and so do women. And so if we can think about these 2 body parts as similar but looking different, that can really help us as we think about how we are approaching, the sexual experience.
As we're exploring. And obviously there's not testicles inside of the labia majora. So for men, if you push hard on the testicle, it hurts really bad.
Right.
So when you talk about the pleasure that men can get from being touched on the scrotum, it's usually a lighter touch, and that should be instructive on how to touch the labia majora.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And so then we also have several other body parts. You know, we have the mons, which is like kind of like the pubic bone above the whole vagina and above the labias. And that, when there's pressure on that, that can really add to the pleasure that both the woman and the husband can feel. That can really add and contribute to arousal and preparing the bodies for intercourse. There's also a part of skin called the frenulum, which is very thin, and it kind of almost acts like a housing mechanism because a lot of other parts kind of attach to it. The labia is attached to it. The vagina is in the middle of it, and the clitoris is at the top of it. And so it doesn't have too much of a function, except it kind of acts like a base. But the part that we want to really focus on is the clitoris. And the clitoris can be found at the top of the labias and is often covered. It's hidden. If you're looking at it, it's veiled. And technically, there's a term, a hood, that covers the clitoris. And so what I really like to think about when it comes to the clitoris is it being a veil. Just like a bride wears a veil when she's getting married, the veil has to be lifted. And it has to, it reveals the bride. And so if we can think about the clitoris in this same way, it can be super helpful. So if we think about the word veil, it starts with the letter V. So we can take our 2 fingers and make the letter V with it and place, our fingers on the labias and pull back towards our belly button. And if we do this, this is going to pull back the veil, the hood, and reveal the clitoris. This is where the head of the clitoris lives. So this is beautiful. Now, since we're talking about mirroring parts, the head of the clitoris mirrors the head of the penis.
Yes.
So here is an awesome, awesome fact. Most of the female pleasure when it comes to orgasm is going to come from the clitoris. Now, this is kind of like the big mystery, right? This is where so much lack of information exists. So just to give you a scientific number, the clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings in a very small space, right? It's like not even an inch long, right? It's like maybe half an inch. The head of the clitoris. Now, the head of the penis has 4,000 nerve endings in the total penis. So that's the head and the shaft. So the pleasure is more spread out in the penis where it's more concentrated in the clitoris.
Yeah.
So why is this information valuable? The answer is because a lot of times, especially men and women, when we're just growing up with what we're being taught in textbooks and especially social media, we may think that for the women, most of her pleasure is going to come from the penis entering the vagina, just intercourse, right? So it really matters the size of the penis, the pace of intercourse, the thrust, the amount of thrust that's going in, that those are the contributing factors to the woman experiencing pleasure, right? That's kind of what we're taught.
Yeah, that's what we're taught in media for sure.
That is what we're taught. But once we learn correct anatomy, we're like, actually, women are going to feel some pleasure from intercourse, but it's not a significant amount when we look at nerve endings. So what this means is is that clitoris stimulus is going to be key for female pleasure, not just penetrative intercourse in the vagina.
And it's very rare that a woman receives most of her pleasure from intercourse like that. Now, speaking of size, length is probably not a big deal at all. It's irrelevant when it comes to these nerve endings that you're talking about. And when you really look at the clitoris and the size of it internally, the way that it's shaped, it almost looks like a wishbone. The head of it comes out and you can see it, but then it kind of wraps around the hole of the vagina.
Yes.
At the top.
Yes.
And so there may be some people that say, width might help with that as far as penetration, but it's really how you use the penis to stimulate those nerve endings in the clitoris. And so we'll do a more in-depth podcast on this at some point where we get into the anatomy. But if you pull up the clitoris, and I mean, be careful when you look at this online, but look at it scientifically, an illustration of it, you'll see the size of the clitoris is actually much larger than we've been taught.
Yes.
Most people do not understand how large the clitoris actually is.
Right.
And so when you're talking about pleasuring, let's say using your fingers to pleasure the vagina, we focus a lot on the head of the clitoris, but there's other parts around the head of the clitoris that are really stimulating because the clitoris behind that skin exists beyond what you can see.
That's so true.
And so exploration, everyone's so different too, but exploration with your spouse together, figuring out where the parts are that feels good and really maybe changing the way that you've been doing things for so many years to increase that pleasure will help improve your intimacy.
That's right.
But knowledge is power, and information brings inspiration. So we feel like it's important to just talk about it. And a lot of people aren't comfortable talking about this. And the ones that usually are very scientific or they're doctors and they're talking about it from a medical perspective. We're coaches and we're two people that have a lot of experience over 20 years exploring this. And we, you can make fun of us or think that we're weird for sharing this, but we think it's so important for married couples to know these things so that they can increase their intimacy as much as they possibly can throughout their lives. Because for us, we want to help, but we also in society depend on strong marriages. And this is one of those things. It's one part of marriage that can help strengthen your marriage.
That's right. So now the head of the clitoris is the only part that is on the outside. And again, the only way you can get to that is if you are able to unveil the head of the clitoris. By pulling back that hood, that veil. But there is so much more to the clitoris inside that we don't see.
Right.
And so just like the penis has a shaft, the clitoris has a shaft.
Yeah.
And so if you just imagine in your mind going backwards, almost like the shape of a penis, that when you go backwards from the head of the clitoris, there's also a shaft. And then after you get to the end of the shaft is where the clitoris kind of almost wings out.
Yeah.
Like how you were saying, almost like a wishbone. And so it has these two long kind of wings that extend downward and wrap around, and they connect to a whole nother network of nerves. This is why female orgasms can be so intense and can be also described as like a whole body experience, because the clitoris is communicating to these other nerves when it's being stimulated. And so you have at least 15,000 nerves once you activate the clitoris that are involved. That's
amazing.
A lot of nerves going on there.
Well, when you think about 4,000 nerves in the penis, and we focus so much on male pleasure.
Right.
And then when we really get down into the nitty gritty of female pleasure, you're talking about 8,000 nerves in the clitoris.
Yeah.
Connecting to another system of 15,000 nerves. The woman was created with way more nerve endings meant for physical pleasure.
Yes. And the clitoris only has one purpose. It has nothing to do with reproduction. It is for pleasure.
That's awesome.
It's the only the only reason it exists.
So when you think about sexual power and sexual potential,
yes,
the woman has
incredible potential.
Mechanics that are meant for that. It is awesome. As a man thinking about my wife and thinking about what there is to discover there, that's really exciting.
It is. It is. And so I think what is something that is never discussed is also what happens when we know that there is a shaft to the clitoris, right? Because there are nerve endings in that shaft. And so as it is stimulated, as we start to say, I didn't even know that exists. Well, let's discover it. Let's see what happens. As you go to stimulate the shaft of the clitoris, you also end up stimulating something that's called the Skene's glands. Now, these are important because it's really hard to see these. But these glands are key to lubrication. And we know that lubrication is so valuable, so important for intercourse and to make that part enjoyable. So think about this. As we're stimulating the clitoris and igniting and the Skene's glands, it's lubricating the vagina so that intercourse is also more pleasurable. It's amazing how it works. There's also another gland called the Bartholin gland. And these ones you won't be able to see on the outside at all. They are very internal and they are more at the base of the labia. But as you know, and just even know that there are glands there, and think about stimulating those glands, just rubbing around, adding a little pressure. You can stimulate those glands also for lubrication. So we have two sets of glands, one more at the top near the clitoris and more at the bottom of the vagina, and that are made specifically to be stimulated to help lubricate the vagina.
Now, if anyone thinks that it's wrong to learn about the anatomy like this, then I would take a step back and, pray about it and, talk with your spouse about it. But I think we're supposed to learn as much as we can about our bodies.
Yes. And one thing that is very interesting when you look at the definitions of the word adult, or you look at couple, or you look at intimacy, part of being adult is saying you are of age to enter into a sexual relationship.
Yes.
Part of being a couple, part of being married is that in most cultures, that is when it is deemed appropriate to enter into the sexual relationship and discover these things. So it's okay that you weren't taught these things when you were younger. It is totally okay.
Yeah, you shouldn't be taught all these things when you're younger, when you're not ready for it. It's not the time yet.
That's right. It wasn't appropriate. And now it is.
Yay. It's awesome. Let's get into it.
It's totally appropriate. So it's okay if it feels like an adjustment for you. It is an adjustment, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's beautiful. It's supposed to be an adjustment, and you are totally meant to do it now.
And if you're bored with your sex as a married couple, and that's another thing the media does. The media makes it sound like married sex is boring sex.
No.
It's the biggest lie in the world. When you're married and you start discovering each other and you start really learning how each other work, there's no way that you can get that from one night stands or, just temporary pleasure. This is a deep emotional, spiritual process, and it is a lifelong, never-ending discovery. And so if you're bored with sex, then education and continuing to know that you can explore and know that you can discover more together, not just from a physical perspective, but also emotionally and spiritually, how you can continue down that path together. This is what is meant to bring us together. This gives men motivation to get closer to their wives. And it also gives women motivation to get closer to their husbands too, because for so long, people have thought, oh, well, it's just for my husband's pleasure. I'm just going to do my duty. That is not the way it was intended to be. And if that's the way you think, then I'll just tell you that I believe that you're wrong. You're not built for it just to be duty for you. You're built for both of you to enjoy this intimate relationship that physical pleasure is just one part of. but it's an awesome part. And it can help you to get deeper in your sensitivity toward each other, your sensation for just that closeness and that connection and that energy that brings you closer together. But it also can lead to that pleasure that we're talking about through the clitoris and through the penis. But if you're not exploring that and not finding new avenues to enjoy this, then it will get boring and it will become rote and it will just become duty and it will just be about release for the man. And then there's all kinds of other things that come along with that aren't ideal for marriage. So these discoveries can really open new windows and doors in your relationship to bring you closer together. I promise you that. And it might take you years to discover these things. But if you're on that path, what an exciting path to be on.
It's true. And I think it's so important to talk about spirituality here for just a minute, because if you believe in God, if you believe that you are created by Him in His image, then you have to go through the process of saying, He created this part of the woman.
Yeah.
He created the clitoris, and its only purpose is pleasure. And so then it becomes our job to start to move in to that part of our creation and not deny it, not pretend it doesn't exist, or not pretend that there's something naughty with that part, but actually grow and develop into becoming the fullest version and fulfilling the measure of our creation.
Yeah, and we say, we read in the scriptures that the body is the temple of God. And there's a lot of things that we can compare, through spirituality when you think about it that way too. And we were talking about the veiling of the clitoris and unveiling that and discovering this is a spiritual process. And this is why it's so important that sexuality is supposed to be within marriage.
Right.
It makes that even more understandable.
Yes.
Why it's so important that marriage is the right place and time for this.
Yeah. So one of the reasons we felt like it was so important to have a podcast episode dedicated to this is, let's stop to think about this question. What if a husband and a wife don't know these things, right? What if they were to just continue on with the very elementary, sex ed that they were given? This is what happens. The woman experiences mainly intercourse and mainly pleasure through intercourse in the vagina. And as we know, there's not a lot of nerve endings there. So it's somewhat pleasurable. And a lot of times my clients go after, when we discuss like what their first experience was, this is like the number one response. That was it? Like, what's the big deal? Right? It's not so pleasurable that we're running back for more. And this is why. Is because the fundamental pleasure part of the female has yet to be unleashed. And so can you imagine a married couple, they love each other, but they never know this information.
Right.
They go on thinking that the vagina is the main source of female pleasure. And year after year, they're wondering why it's so awesome for the husband and not as awesome for the woman. There can come a lot of negative thoughts with that. The wife might think something's wrong with her. She might think something is wrong with her husband, or that he's selfish, or that he's not a good lover. The sheer amount of negative thoughts and negative emotions is real. And again, there's just no need for it. There's no need for a wife to go on thinking she's doing everything wrong, or her husband is so animalistic. There's no need for it, but we understand why it's there. It's because these things aren't clarified. But imagine how much better things can be when you start to know these things, accept them, explore them, and discover them for yourself and as a couple.
Well, as a man, it also is something that we think about. Like, we may tend to fantasize, and because we're visual, we think about other ways that we can get pleasure, right? Pornography is a major challenge for men in this day and age too. And I think that as I've discovered that there's more and more and more for us to discover, the temptation to do those things goes down.
Yeah.
Because you don't feel the need to look at the grass that looks greener in the other yards, right?
Right.
This is what coveting is all about, right?
Yeah.
Now, we're commanded to do certain things. We're commanded not to do certain things. But when we have the kind of relationship with our spouse where we're exploring and we're discovering together, we realize that everything that we need, all of the desires that we have, can all be fulfilled at home.
Yes.
And they should be, and they're meant to be fulfilled at home. And God has given us a way for them all to be fulfilled at home.
That's right.
It's not like we should just, sacrifice and just grunt it out and just, live with it the rest of our lives. Like when we discover it, there is a way for us to really be satisfied beyond what we can even imagine now.
Yeah. I love that you said it's meant to be.
Yeah.
It really is meant to be that way. It is meant to be discovered together when you have two people who are committed to one another. And that is how it is set up.
It's not like God says, be married, and then I'm going to limit you
Right.
and make you miserable the rest of your life.
No.
That's not him.
No. There is so much to explore. Okay, let's wrap things up.
Okay.
The one of the reasons that we brought this up is because when we are stuck thinking really negative things about sexual intercourse, about pleasure, whether it's about ourselves or our spouse, when we have those negative thoughts, we're going to feel negative.
Yeah.
And if we just continue to enter into a night, of sex because we feel it's our duty, and we enter into that experience with negative thoughts and negative feelings, we are never going to enjoy this.
Right.
And we are going to end up having a ton of anger and resentment towards our spouse, towards the concept of marriage, maybe even towards God, and it's not necessary. That's why being educated on these things, challenging our own thoughts that we've had about it up to this point is valuable. It's a process that we are meant to go through and we need to go through. One final point is, as we are learning these things, the goal is to have a balanced number of orgasms. This is really important. I think it's really important for husbands to hear this, because when your wives come to me as a client, they are like, this is all for my husband. I'm doing it for my husband. His pleasure is more important. The number of orgasms seems almost irrelevant to her. When we make the goal a balanced number of orgasms, more of her is going to be considered in the entire process. Her thoughts, her emotions, her anatomy. And that will really help release a lot of these negative thoughts that she has as she enters into a sexual experience. So, and they don't all have to be at the same time, the same night. There are so many different ways you can approach that goal, and that's up to you guys to decide. But if you have in mind the goal is the same number of orgasms for the husband and the wife, now we're talking about something real. So let us leave you with that. Any other final thoughts?
I think that's true. And I think that for men, there are times when you orgasm and I don't.
Yep.
And that's okay. And that might seem like such a weird thought to some men, but remember, when you have an orgasm, you release energy, and that's that intimate sexual energy that draws you closer together. And there's, like, I've talked about tantric sex in this a couple times, but the whole idea of that is controlling your orgasm, mostly for males.
Yeah.
And if you can go through experiences where you make sure that your wife comes first, right? Put her first. And even at times when you don't orgasm, you can maintain that energy for the next time. It makes not just the next time better, but that time in between, you're more connected because you have that energy drawing you closer to her still, and you haven't released it. So there's a ways to improve that connection, not just by getting off all the time, right? Really thinking about this as something that you do together and something that you are sharing together and communicating about. And I'm not giving you answers right now for you. You've got to discover this, but I'm giving you possibilities of how you can be closer to your wife. And when you figure out how to help her have more orgasms than you, or the same amount, or close to the same amount, there will be so many walls that will be torn down and you will be closer together.
It's true.
And even just the attempt to try, even if you aren't figuring it out yet, just trying and showing her that you care makes all the difference in the world. And so be a selfless lover and think about your spouse and ask questions and be curious about how to improve that side of your relationship, and your whole relationship will improve.
All right. Preach, preach, preach. Okay, well, we hope that you guys will be able to think about these things and really start to apply them. And if you know anyone who is recently married or newly engaged, give them this podcast because they're probably going to need it. And feel free to share it with anyone that you know that may be struggling with these things. Because remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you can restore it with your spouse. So thank you so much for listening today, and we hope you will join us again next week.
Bye.